Hello, welcome to the literary and jury charge for the 200 class. We're going to start out with some congressional record, and the subject is family rental tax. And I will read this at 180. Ready? Mr. Speaker, in the closing days of the 98th Congress, I would like to discuss a cruel and burdensome hardship that is about to fall on American families who rent an apartment or a home to a family member. This burden is the family rental tax, which is a provision of the Internal Revenue Tax Code. In short, this tax disallows some of the normal deductions on rental property when the tenant is a relative. Today I am reintroducing a bill which will be put to an end to the family's rental tax. There is a potential harm with the family rental tax. Even if the property is rented at full market value, this new tax would impose a strict penalty on the property owner. I believe the family rental tax is a step backward. We must continue to recognize the family unit as a primary source of support for all of its members, and in particular, its older members. The bill that I have developed will correct the language of the code to more clearly show that Congress supports the limits on deductions on vacation rentals, but does not support the limits on principal residences. Part 1 would change the language of Section 547(3)(d) to allow the normal deductions with rental property when the taxpayer rents to a family member. Part 2 would change the language of Section 8399R of the Code to restrict the tax allowances for taxpayers who have vacation rental property that is not rented on a 12-month or yearly basis. We are fortunate because the Internal Revenue Service will not enforce the family rental tax in this tax year. I urgently encourage my distinguished colleagues, all taxpayers themselves, to consider this matter before the close of Congress. Okay. The next section you will hear is impeaching a witness. Ready? Your Honor, this is verbatim. This is the report of September 11, 2013. This report is authored by Deputy Gregory T. Conrad and Kirk J. Taylor. Quote, while at the location, a Mrs. Beverly Young, a female, at age 45, 11278 Orange Street, phone 992-1180, contacted us and stated that she often talked with the victim, Susan Nathaniel. Mrs. Young further stated that an unknown male who lives somewhere in the neighborhood had been bothering the victim by asking her for dates. Mrs. Young said that the victim would not identify the male, but merely said that she would be surprised if she, Mrs. Young, knew who it was. The unknown male had been calling Susan Nathaniel since the death of her husband. Mrs. Young advised us that the victim stated that she would never date this male because she feared him, explaining that he was crazy, unquote. Now, as an officer of the court, Your Honor, I would like to explain to the court that when I interviewed Mrs. Young myself, she indicated the following, that she should not be interviewed, specifically at the murder site. By that, I mean the Nathaniel residence. She indicated she, Lori Engelbrook, and Mrs. Rayburn, and another unknown female, who she does not know by name, were apparently talking near the corner, and the deputy approached them. She, Mrs. Young, told me that she did not make the following statement to the deputy, quote, who lives somewhere in the neighborhood, unquote. She said that Mrs. Nathaniel did not specifically point out this individual who was making the phone calls to be living somewhere in the neighborhood. She further told me that Mrs. Nathaniel did not tell her that this individual was asking her for dates. Mrs. Young further told me that Mrs. Nathaniel did not say, quote, would not identify, but apparently Susan Nathaniel told her, quote, could not identify the male. Mrs. Young further told me that the following language, quote, she merely said that she would be surprised if she, Mrs. Young, knew who it was. The male had been calling her since the death of her, meaning Susan Nathaniel's husband, end of quote. Mrs. Young said that she did not recall saying that to the deputy who interviewed her. Obviously, there are substantial differences between what Mrs. Young is telling me and what Mrs. Young told the deputy sheriff on that date. I would suggest, Your Honor, that I believe that I can impeach my own witness. Okay, I'm going to proceed with this article that we started in the last class on the chocolate wars. Here we go. By the time he was 20, he was running his own wholesale candy firm, peddling sweets to shopkeepers in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Around that time, he married Ethel Kissick. Their only son, Forrest, was born 2 years later. Life in the Mars household quickly turned desperate. Practically every penny went into the company, leaving nothing for rent or food. Ethel Mars divorced her husband on the grounds of non-support. She was awarded custody of her 6-year-old Forrest, whom she sent to live with his grandparents in North Battleford, an isolated mining town in Canada. She remained in Minneapolis, working in a department store. Soon after the divorce, Frank remarried and made 2 more failed attempts to start a candy business. Finally, with his last $400, he plunged into candy making a 4th time, calling his enterprise the Mars O-Bar Company. This time, his business was a success. His best seller was a buttercream concoction. Meanwhile, up in Canada, Forrest heard little about his father, and what he heard mostly came from his mother, who often referred to Frank as the miserable failure. She constantly carped on young Forrest to do better for himself. Her son took the goading seriously. Although most of his classmates never finished school, Forrest won a partial scholarship to the University of California, Berkeley. To pay his room and board, he took a job in the school cafeteria, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and hauling garbage. In the summer, he joined a team traveling the country, hawking Camel cigarettes. On the final night of the Camel tour, Forrest told his sales team to plaster State Street, a main thoroughfare in Chicago, with Camel posters. The stunt landed Forrest in jail and made headlines. That was how his father, Frank, who had established his candy business in Chicago, read about him. He came to jail and posted bail for his son. When they met at a 5-and-dime soda counter, Frank said nothing of his disappearance from Forrest's life, and Forrest asked little about the past. Instead, the 2 men talked business. The story goes that they were drinking chocolate malted milks, while Forrest was telling his father that his candy didn't stay fresh long enough to be shipped across the country. "Why don't you make something that I can sell all over the United States?" Forrest proposed. "What would you do?" his father asked. Forrest replied, "Well, why don't you put this chocolate malted milk in a candy bar?" Years later, he explained, "I just said anything that entered my head. But I'll be damned if a short time afterward he has a candy bar and it's a chocolate malted drink." The new creation was strikingly different from the competition. Its solid chocolate coating kept the candy fresh, and because malt flavored nougat, a fluffy whipped filling of egg whites and corn syrup, was the main ingredient, the candy bar was much bigger than most other bars, tasted just as chocolatey, and cost much less to produce. Dubbed the Milky Way, it was a huge success. Forrest finished college and then joined his father's firm, renamed Mars Incorporated. The son was assigned the job of buying the company's raw materials, but he strutted around the Chicago plant as though he owned it, shouting orders. Forrest also argued incessantly with his father about the future of the firm. He questioned Frank's judgment and demanded that the company expand. Frank Mars didn't share his son's aggressiveness. He believed he was making enough money. In 1932, they had a huge argument. Forrest demanded a third of the stock in the company or he would leave. "Things got bitter," he remembered, "and I'm not proud of this." Frank did not give his son a third of the company, but he did give him $50,000 plus the foreign rights to the Milky Way. Determined to prove he could succeed alone, Forrest set out for Europe with his wife Audrey and their newborn son, Forrest Jr. 15 months after their stormy parting, Frank Mars collapsed on the floor of the Chicago factory. He was rushed to a hospital and died a few weeks later of kidney failure. He was just 50 years old. After a few failed business schemes in Europe, Forrest decided to seek his fortune in confections as well. First, he needed to learn how to become a candy maker himself. So in 1932, he traveled to Switzerland to study with the masters, working first at the factory of the late Jean Tobler, who had introduced an opulent line of chocolate bars, including his famous Toblerone, and the next at the factory of Henry Nestle, the co-inventor of milk chocolate. A year later, he headed for England. Mars decided to start small. Like his father before him, he set up a tiny kitchen in the small industrial town about 30 miles outside of London. He and his family lived in a one-room flat behind the factory, while Forrest went to work creating a candy bar he called the Mars Bar. Like his father, he devoted everything he had to the product, leaving little for his wife and son. Their situation became bleak. The heat in the apartment never worked, and there was little food. When Forrest refused to remedy the situation, his wife took their son and returned to the United States to live with her parents. In 1933, with 4 employees working in a room barely bigger than a clerk's office, he produced his first candy bars. He sold them himself on trips to London, and within a few months he had established a small following. While in England, he found time to travel through Spain. One day he spotted some soldiers eating chocolate that had been coated with a sugary candy. Protected by the shell, the chocolate withstood the heat of the Spanish summer. That gave him an idea, and in 1939 he returned to America. Once ashore, he headed for Hershey to work out the deal that became M&M. Bruce Murray had developed his image of management from watching his father at Hershey, and he was completely unprepared for the hard driving way of life that Forrest Mars demanded. In the years following World War II, Murray took the brunt of Mars's ire. With its military contracts disappearing, M&M needed to drum up new business. Murray was already putting in 16-hour days trying to open up distribution channels and secure shelf space in stores. But Forrest wasn't satisfied. He ordered Murray to report to him every morning with figures on the previous day's sales. If the numbers didn't match his expectations, he'd humiliate Murray by scribbling "failed" in red ink across the report and post it in the men's room. Finally, Murray confronted Forrest about being treated badly. The encounter turned into an out-and-out brawl, with both men screaming insults and accusations. Ordered out of the plant, Murray resigned, with Forrest buying out his minority stake. Meanwhile, Mars Incorporated, Frank's original company, was beginning to founder. The Milky Way still sold well, as did the Snickers bar and the Three Musketeers, but products introduced after Frank's death had been less popular, and the plan itself was becoming outmoded and inefficient. Forrest Mars had always viewed his father's Chicago factory as his own. After all, he was the one who gave Frank the idea for the Milky Way, but Frank had left the majority of the stock to his second wife and their daughter, Patricia, Forrest's half-sister. Forrest had tried to persuade them that he should be running the business, but got nowhere. Then in 1945, his mother, Ethel, died, and half of her stock passed to Forrest, as stipulated in Frank's will. Forrest used his inheritance to stage a long-running takeover siege that lasted until 1964, when he at last won complete control. Within days, life at the plant changed forever. After ordering executives into the oak-paneled conference room, Forrest proceeded to set the tone for his regime. "I'm a religious man," he told them. Then he sank to his knees and began a litany. "I pray for Milky Way. I pray for Snickers." No one in the room dared move. Forrest ripped out the executive dining room, fired the French chef, tore down the office walls, stripped the oak paneling, and sold the art collection, the rugs, the stained glass, and the corporate helicopter. He then increased salaries 30%. It was in this factory that Forrest had developed the no-nonsense principles that he now would use to guide the Mars empire. He paid his managers 3 and 4 times what the other companies offered. In return, he demanded complete devotion, asking employees to work with him 12 and 14 hours a day. He installed a time clock for everyone, then offered a bonus to those who were never late. He lectured on quality with the zeal and regularity of a preacher. An improperly wrapped candy bar or a pinhole in the chocolate coating sent him into a tantrum. Perfection was pursued to the tiniest detail. Millions of M&Ms were rejected for sale every day because the M's missed the mark or their shells didn't glow. Cleanliness was another obsession. On any given day, the acceptable level of bacteria on a Mars factory floor was, and still is, less than the average level in a household kitchen sink. Forrest completely overhauled the company's approach to management. The structure he installed is largely unchanged to this day. Everyone has the same size desk. Everyone answers his own telephone. To encourage communication, managers sit in wagon wheel fashion, encircled by junior associates. There are no offices, no partitions, and there is little regard for rank and no need for office memos or meetings. If you want something, you walk over to the boss and ask for it. Working for Forrest was not about personality or style. He didn't care what you looked like or who you knew. All that mattered was how well you could do the job, a trait that won him much loyalty. Okay, there's more to this article, but I will finish it up in our next class. I'm going to read from the Survey of Criminal Law, comparing civil law and criminal law. The difference between civil law and criminal law appears obvious, and great differences do exist. Yet most students are surprised at the similarities that can be found. The source of most of the dissimilarities between criminal law and civil law is the differing objectives of the two. The purpose of criminal law is twofold. First, it is intended to prevent behavior that society has determined undesirable. A second purpose of criminal law is to punish those who take the acts deemed undesirable by society. Arguably, there is only one purpose: to prevent antisocial behavior. Under this theory, punishment is only used as a tool to achieve the primary goal of preventing antisocial behavior. In any event, prevention and punishment are essential reasons why we have criminal law and a criminal justice system. On the other hand, civil law has as its primary purpose the compensation of those injured by someone else's behavior. It is argued that the real purpose of civil law is the same as that of criminal law. By allowing lawsuits against individuals who have behaved in a manner not consistent with society's rules, civil law actually acts to prevent nonconformity. However, prevention of bad behavior may be more the consequence of civil law than the purpose. To understand this, you must know something about civil law. Many definitions of civil law exist. The American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language defines it as the body of law dealing with the rights of private citizens. Black's Law Dictionary defines civil law as laws concerned with civil or private rights and remedies, as contrasted with criminal laws. This author prefers a negative definition similar to the latter, such as all law, except that which is criminal law. Whatever definition you accept, many areas of law fall under the umbrella of civil law. Two of the largest categories of civil law are contract law and tort law. Contract law is a branch of civil law that deals with written agreements between two or more parties. You probably have already entered into a contract. Apartment leases, credit card agreements, and book of the month club agreements are all contracts. To have a contract, you must have two or more people agreeing to behave in a specific manner in the future. Both parties benefit from the contract, and both lose something. For example, when you agree to lease an apartment, you gain the use of the apartment during the lease period, and your landlord loses the right to use the property. The flip side is that the landlord gets your money in the form of rent, and you lose the value of that rent. You promise to pay rent at a specified time, and the landlord promises to give you the use of the premises during the rental period. In contract law, the duties and obligations to the parties are created by the parties themselves and appear in the form of a contract. If you violate your obligation to your landlord under the contract, for example, you move out earlier than the contract allows, you have committed a civil wrong called a breach of contract. The landlord may sue you for your breach and receive damages. Damages are monetary compensation for loss. Tort law is a branch of civil law that is concerned with civil wrongs, but not contract actions. We have all seen the television ads for personal injury attorneys. These attorneys are practicing in the tort law area. A civil wrong other than a breach of contract is known as a tort. Torts are different from contracts in that the duty owed another party in contract law is created by the written agreement. In tort law, the duty is imposed by the law. For example, at a party you are struck and injured by a beer bottle that has been heaved by an intoxicated partier. A tort has been committed. The partier is known as a tortfeasor, which is the term used to describe one who commits a tort. Yet why does that partier owe you a duty to not strike you with a flying beer bottle? You have not entered into a contract with the partier where he has promised not to harm you in this manner. The answer is that the law imposes the duty to act with caution when it is possible to injure another or cause injury to another's property. This duty is imposed upon all people at all times. The law requires that we all act reasonably when we are conducting our lives. That concludes our jury charge and literary for the 200 class.